Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful day. So here's how it started. Like one of those moments where you almost let yourself believe, maybe, just maybe, the worst is finally behind you. It was early evening, the kind of quiet, ordinary evening that's supposed to feel safe. The house smelled like cooked rice and warm broth. The table was already set, and for the first time in a long time, James's father was the one doing the inviting. Not James, not Mrs. Hoan, his father. He called earlier that day, voice calm, almost gentle. "Bring Diep over," he said. "Let's eat together. We're family. We should make peace." And when James heard that, he froze for a second, because his father didn't speak like that. Not Tu Diep, not after everything. James glanced at Mrs. Hoan like, "Did you hear that right?" And Mrs. Hoan's face softened, just for a moment, like her heart had been waiting for this exact sentence for months. "Maybe he's finally accepting," she whispered, like she didn't want the hope to evaporate if she said it too loudly. James didn't answer at first. He only tightened his grip on the phone, and his eyes flicked toward Diep, who was standing nearby, quietly folding Nye's jacket, pretending she wasn't listening. Diep heard every word, and she didn't look excited. She didn't smile. She just swallowed and nodded once, as if she were agreeing to walk into a room that might contain either forgiveness or a trap. Still she went, because Diep had always been the kind of person who tried to do the right thing, even when the right thing didn't feel safe. That evening, when they arrived, James's father was already at the door. And this was the first thing that felt strange. He didn't scowl. He didn't turn away. He didn't make a sarcastic comment or pretend Diep didn't exist. He actually greeted her. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "It's cold out." His voice wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't sharp either. It was controlled, measured, almost polite. Diep lowered her head respectfully. "Thank you, Dad." James stiffened at the word "dad," because that word had never landed gently in this house. But tonight, no one argued. Mrs. Hoan followed behind them, hands clasped tight in front of her, like she was holding her breath with her fingers. And then Nye, sweet, unstoppable Nye, ran inside like a little burst of sunlight. "Grandpa! Grandpa!" she shouted. "I'm hungry. Mom made me promise not to eat snacks so I could eat more dinner." Her voice bounced off the walls, bright and innocent, and for a moment it actually softened the air. James's father looked down at her. His expression didn't melt, but it shifted, like he was remembering something from a long time ago. "Wash your hands," he said, gruff but not unkind. Nye saluted dramatically. "Yes, sir." And just like that, the table began to fill. Plates were passed, chopsticks clinked. The rice steamer clicked open with a puff of heat. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Diep sat carefully, posture straight, hands folded neatly when she wasn't eating. She was trying. You could see it. She wasn't pushing. She wasn't challenging anyone. She was just being polite. Mrs. Hoan tried to keep the conversation light. "How was your day?" she asked her husband gently. James's father nodded as if that question didn't offend him. "Same as always." James tried to add something to bridge the silence. "Work's been busy," he said, "but it's manageable." And then Nye jumped in, because Nye always filled the empty spaces. "Dad said manageable means he's tired but pretending he's not," she announced proudly, like she'd uncovered a secret code. Mrs. Hoan let out a small laugh, the kind of laugh that sounded like relief. Even James cracked a smile. Just for a second. Diep looked at Nye with that soft expression mothers have when their child is the only reason they're still standing. And then, across the table, James's father stood up. "I made soup," he said. Everyone paused. Because again, he didn't usually cook. Not for guests. Not for peace offerings. He walked to the kitchen, returned with a pot, and began ladling soup into bowls. And then he did something that made the whole room go quiet. He personally served Diep first. He placed the bowl in front of her carefully, like it mattered that he didn't spill a drop. Diep blinked, surprised. "Thank you," she said, voice calm, though her eyes flashed with uncertainty. James stared so hard he forgot to breathe. Mrs. Hoan's eyes shone with cautious hope, like she wanted to believe this was the turning point. James's father sat back down. "Eat," he said simply. The soup smelled rich, warm broth, herbs, maybe a bit of ginger. The steam curled up gently. It looked comforting, safe. Diep lifted her spoon, hesitated, then took a sip. Nothing happened. For a few minutes, the meal continued. Ly talked non-stop. She told Grandpa about a drawing she made, about a friend at school who said her lunch smelled too healthy, about how she wanted a pet rabbit, but Mom said rabbits were too much responsibility, which Ly argued was unfair because she could totally take care of it. James's father listened, mostly silent, but he didn't shut her down. James thought, maybe this is real. Maybe tonight is actually okay. Diep relaxed a tiny fraction. Not much, but enough that she raised her glass. "Dad," she said softly, "thank you for inviting us. I appreciate it." Mrs. Hoan nodded quickly. "Yes, thank you." James's father lifted his own glass in a slow, almost formal way. The moment was delicate, like a thin sheet of ice that might hold if everyone stepped carefully. They drank, and for a brief heartbeat, it truly looked like peace. But then Diep's fingers twitched. She set her glass down, slow. Her face changed, not dramatically at first, just a slight tightening around her eyes. James noticed immediately. "Are you okay?" he asked, leaning closer. Diep opened her mouth to answer, but her words came out quieter than usual. I feel a little..." She swallowed. "Dizzy." Mrs. Hoan's smile vanished. "Dizzy? Did you stand up too fast?" Diep shook her head, but the movement seemed to make it worse. Her brows pinched, and she placed a hand over her stomach. Then she winced. Not a mild discomfort. A sharp cramp. The kind that grabs you suddenly and makes you fold inward. James pushed his chair back slightly. Diep tried to inhale, but her breath came shallow. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. The color drained from her face so quickly. It looked unreal. Cold sweat appeared along her hairline. Ly stopped talking mid-sentence. "Mom?" she whispered, suddenly small. Diep blinked hard like she was trying to force her vision to focus. Her lips parted again, but instead of speaking, she made a tiny sound, like pain caught in her throat. James stood up fast enough his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Diep," he said, voice rising. Diep tried to stand too. She pushed against the table, knees shaking. For half a second, it looked like she might make it. Then her body swayed. Her eyes rolled slightly, and her hand slipped off the table's edge. "James," she whispered, and then she collapsed. Right there, in front of everyone. The bowl rattled, soup sloshing. Mrs. Hoan gasped, hands flying to her mouth. Ly screamed, "Mom! Mom!" James lunged forward and caught Diep before her head hit the floor. He dropped to his knees, cradling her like she weighed nothing, like she was already disappearing. "Diep, look at me!" he shouted, voice cracking. "Hey! Hey! Stay with me!" Diep's eyes fluttered, unfocused. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. James's hands shook as he tried to keep her upright. Mrs. Hoan rushed over, kneeling beside them. "Oh my God! James, call an ambulance, now!" James fumbled for his phone like his fingers didn't belong to him. He dialed with trembling hands, voice frantic, as the call connected. "My wife! She collapsed. She can't stand. She's sweating. Please, please hurry." Ly clung to Diep's arm, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. "Mom, don't do that. Don't leave me. Mom, please." And across the table, James's father didn't move. He sat perfectly still. His face was unreadable, not shock, not panic, just stillness. And that stillness, more than the collapse, more than the screaming, made something cold creep up James's spine. Because in that moment, while his wife lay limp in his arms and his daughter cried like her heart was breaking, his father looked like a man who was watching something go exactly as planned. The ambulance siren grew louder in the distance. James squeezed Diep tighter, whispering urgently into her hair like his voice could pull her back. "Stay with me," he begged. "Please, please stay." And as the front door burst open with paramedics rushing in, Mrs. Hoan turned her head slowly toward her husband. Her eyes were wide. Her mouth trembled. And the look she gave him wasn't just fear. It was disbelief. Like she was seeing him for the first time. Because the question hanging in the air wasn't just what happened. It was, "What did you do?" The paramedics moved fast. One of them knelt beside Diep immediately, checking her pulse, lifting her eyelids, asking questions James could barely process. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" "Sir, what did she eat? How long ago did symptoms start?" James's voice came out broken and jagged. "Soup. She had soup. My dad served it. She was fine, and then she just..." He couldn't finish the sentence. His throat locked up like his body refused to speak it aloud. Ly was still crying, gripping Diep's sleeve so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Mom, wake up," she sobbed. "Mom, please, please." Mrs. Hoan pulled Ly back gently, trying to protect her from seeing too much, but Ly fought like a child who knew instinctively that letting go even for a second might mean losing everything. The paramedics lifted Diep onto the stretcher. The straps clicked into place. Oxygen mask on. IV started. James hovered like he was glued to her, one hand gripping the side rail of the stretcher, as if that metal bar was the only thing keeping her alive. "We're taking her to the hospital now," one paramedic said. "She's showing signs of acute distress, possible food poisoning or toxin exposure. We need monitoring." The words hit James like a slap. Food poisoning. Toxin exposure. He looked back just once toward the dining table. The soup bowl still sat there, half finished. Steam gone now. The surface of the broth looked calm, like nothing had happened. And his father was standing near the sink, hands at his sides, watching, still too calm. Mrs. Hoan stepped toward him, voice shaking. What is going on? Why is she like that?" James's father didn't answer. The stretcher rolled out. The front door swung open, cold air rushing in. The siren outside screamed into the night. James scooped Ly up with one arm, grabbed his keys with the other, and followed, barely hearing Mrs. Hoan behind them. "Wait, I'm coming too." The ride to the hospital felt like it happened in pieces, a blur of red lights. Ly sobbing into James's shoulder, her small body trembling, repeating the same sentence like a prayer. "Mom, don't leave me. Mom, don't leave me." James kept his eyes on Diep through the ambulance window, watching her chest rise and fall, watching the paramedics' hands moving, like if they stopped even for a second, something terrible would take her away. When they arrived, everything became white walls and fast footsteps, automatic doors, bright fluorescent light, nurses calling out codes, a wheelchair, a stretcher rolling into a corridor James couldn't follow fast enough. "Family stays here," a nurse said firmly, guiding him back. No, I'm her husband," James pleaded. "Please, let me..." "She needs urgent monitoring. We'll update you as soon as we can." And then the door swung shut. Just like that, Diep disappeared behind the emergency room doors. Ly screamed again. This time raw and desperate, like her whole world had been ripped open. James dropped to his knees in the hallway and pulled her close. "It's okay," he lied, because he didn't have anything else to give her. "Mom's strong. She's going to be okay." But his hands were shaking. His chest felt tight, like someone had tied rope around his ribs and kept pulling. Mrs. Hoan arrived a few minutes later, breathless, hair messy, face pale. She looked like she'd aged 10 years since dinner. "What did the doctor say?" she asked. James stared at her, eyes bloodshot already. "They're checking her. They said food poisoning. They said toxin exposure." Mrs. Hoan covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling instantly. "No. No, no, no." Then, after what felt like forever, a doctor came out. He was calm, professional, but his expression had that serious edge that makes your stomach drop before he even speaks. "Are you her husband?" he asked. James stood up so fast he almost stumbled. Yes. That's my wife." "What happened? Is she okay?" The doctor nodded slightly. "She's stable for now, but she's showing clear signs consistent with food poisoning. We've started treatment, but we need to monitor her closely. The next few hours are important." James swallowed hard. "Food poisoning from what?" "We can't confirm the exact cause. Yet," the doctor said carefully. "But based on the symptoms, dizziness, tremors, cold sweat, abdominal cramping, this is not mild. If there was contamination or something ingested that shouldn't have been, it needs to be taken seriously." James felt the floor tilt beneath him. Contamination. Something ingested that shouldn't have been. He looked down at Ly, who was clinging to his shirt, eyes swollen, cheeks streaked with tears. "Can I see her?" Ly whispered. The doctor's face softened. "Not right now, sweetheart. She needs rest. But we'll do our best to help her." Ny's bottom lip trembled. "Mom promised." That sentence, "Mom promised," hit James in the chest like a punch. Because yes, Diep had promised. She promised she wouldn't disappear again. She promised she'd stay. She promised she'd be careful. And then James' mind snapped back to the dinner table. The soup. His father serving it personally. The way his father hadn't looked surprised when Diep collapsed. James' breathing turned shallow. He couldn't sit. He couldn't wait. He couldn't do the thing people tell you to do. Stay calm. Trust the doctors. Because suddenly there was one thought louder than the rest. This wasn't an accident. James turned to Mrs. Hoan, voice low but shaking. "Stay here. Don't leave Ly alone. I'm going back." Mrs. Hoan grabbed his arm. "James, where are you going?" His eyes were wild. "Home." Mrs. Hoan's grip tightened. "No, James, please." "I need to know," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I need to know if he did something." Mrs. Hoan's face went white. "James, don't." But James was already moving. The drive back felt darker than the drive to the hospital. No sirens, no nurses, no movement. Just the empty road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles hurt, his thoughts racing faster than the car. He kept replaying his father's voice. "Let's make peace." He kept seeing that bowl placed in front of Diep like a gift. He kept hearing Ly screaming. When he arrived home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The dining room light was still on, and there, in the middle of it all, James's father stood by the table, calmly wiping it down with a cloth like he was cleaning up after a normal meal. No panic, no pacing, no worry, just wiping. James stepped in, breath sharp. "What did you do?" His father didn't stop wiping. "You're back!" James's voice rose. "I asked you, what did you do to her?" Finally, his father looked up. His eyes were cold, not angry, not emotional. Cold. And then he said it, so casually it almost didn't sound real. "I did that to save you." James froze. His mind refused to accept the sentence like it didn't fit into reality. "What?" James whispered. His father folded the cloth slowly, like he had all the time in the world. "You're blinded. You can't see what she's doing to you. I can." James's chest heaved. She's in the hospital. His father's jaw tightened. She'll live. James stumbled forward, voice cracking apart. You poisoned her. And you're saying that? Like it's nothing? His father's eyes narrowed. Don't use that word. James laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that comes out when you're about to break. Then what do you call it? A lesson? A warning? A piecemeal? His father set the cloth down and finally spoke with more force. I did what you were too weak to do. I protected you. James shook his head, tears rising fast, uncontrollable. Protected me? Dad? You're killing my family. The words came out strangled, and then it happened. James, the man who'd been holding everything together, who'd tried to be the bridge between love and blood, between wife and father. He burst into tears, not silent tears, not gentle tears, the ugly kind, the kind that makes your whole body shake, because the pain has nowhere else to go. You're not saving me, he sobbed. You're destroying us. You're destroying my daughter. You're destroying my wife. You're destroying me. Mrs. Hoan's footsteps echoed behind him. She must have followed, unable to stay at the hospital after hearing his tone. James, she whispered, horrified at the scene. James turned, grabbed her hand so tightly she flinched. Mom, he begged, voice broken. Tell me the truth. Tell me you didn't know. Tell me you didn't help him. Mrs. Hoan's face crumpled. Her eyes flicked to her husband, then back to her son. She started, and her voice collapsed. I didn't think he would. James's blood went cold. You knew, he whispered. Mrs. Hoan cried harder. James, I thought he wanted to scare her. I didn't think he would actually hurt her. James stepped back like he'd been slapped. The silence after that was violent. James's father didn't look ashamed. He looked satisfied, like someone who believed he'd won. James wiped his face with his sleeve, breathing ragged. You're going to be alone, he said, voice trembling but firm now. Do you understand that? You're going to push me out of your life, and you'll sit in this house with your pride and nothing else. His father scoffed. If that's what it takes, James cut him off, voice rising again. No, don't act like a martyr. You did this because you wanted control, because you couldn't stand that I chose someone you didn't approve of. Mrs. Hoan sobbed softly in the corner, hands covering her mouth. James turned and walked out, back to the hospital, back to the beeping machines, back to his real family. When James returned, the emergency room hallway was still cold and bright, and there was Ly, sitting curled up in a chair, clinging to Mrs. Hoan's sleeve with both hands, eyes red and wide, like she'd been crying nonstop. The moment she saw James, she ran to him. Dad, she choked, can I see Mom, please? James knelt down and held her face gently, his voice softer than his eyes. Not yet, sweetheart, but she's still here. She's fighting. Ny's tears spilled again. Mom, don't leave me, she whispered, like saying it to James might send the message through walls. James hugged her tightly, closing his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. And then, through the glass, he saw it. The monitor. Beeping fast, that sharp, rapid sound that turns time into fear. James stood outside the emergency room doors, shoulders hunched, eyes burning red. On one side, his wife fighting to stay alive. On the other side, his father, sitting at home in the darkness, alone at the table, like a victor convinced he'd done the right thing, even as he pushed his own son out of his life. James's father invites Diep to a peace dinner, speaking unusually gently, giving everyone hope that the family tension is finally easing. Diep remains polite, raising a glass in thanks while Ny's cheerful chatter briefly warms the room. But minutes after eating the soup, James's father personally serves her. Diep becomes dizzy, cramps violently, trembles, and breaks into cold sweat before collapsing at the table. James panics, calls an ambulance and rushes her to the hospital as Ly screams, and Mrs. Hoan stares at her husband in disbelief. Doctors warn Diep shows serious signs of food poisoning and needs urgent monitoring. Furious and terrified, James returns home and confronts his father, who coldly admits he did it to save him. James breaks down, accusing him of destroying their family, while Ly clings to Diep at the hospital, begging her not to leave.